It began with a sound no father ever wants to hear in the middle of the night, his child speaking in a voice that doesn't belong to them. I woke up around 2:13 a.m. I remember the time exactly because the red digits on the alarm clock were the only light in the room, casting a soft, bleeding glow across the ceiling. The rest of the house was wrapped in silence, the kind so deep it presses against your ears. At first, I thought it was a dream, a faint murmur like someone praying, soft but steady, words rising and falling with eerie rhythm. I sat up in bed, heart beating louder than it should, straining to hear. It was coming from Mara's room. I threw the blanket off and stepped into the hallway. Cold bit at my feet from the wooden floor. The murmuring grew clearer with every step, low, slow, syllables that scratched against memory, ancient and strange. When I pushed open Mara's door, the breath froze in my chest. She was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open but rolled upward, showing only the whites. Her little hands rested on her lap, fingers twitching, drawing invisible lines in the air. Her mouth moved rapidly, and the sounds, those terrible rhythmic sounds, poured out in perfect cadence. It was Aramaic. I knew it instantly. Not just the language, but the dialect. She was speaking classical Aramaic, a form so old it hadn't been spoken aloud in centuries. I'd spent a decade studying it. I'd translated dead scriptures, cracked open dusty scrolls in the deserts of Syria. But my 7-year-old daughter had never heard a single word of it. Not from me. Not from anyone. I couldn't speak. I stood there like a statue carved out of panic. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, older, deeper, like wind blowing through bones. Then suddenly her head snapped toward me. Not slowly, not like someone turning in surprise. It jerked, like a puppet being yanked by a hidden string. Her eyes locked on mine. Abundi Bashmea, she whispered. Our Father, who art in heaven. The words echoed from somewhere deeper than her throat, and for a second, just one, I saw something in her eyes. A flicker of something behind them. Watching me. Measuring. I rushed to her side. Mara, sweetheart, can you hear me? She blinked once. Then again. Her lips stopped moving. Daddy, she said softly, in her usual voice. Why are you scared? I didn't answer. I just pulled her into my arms and held her tight. She didn't resist. She laid her head against my shoulder, breathing slow and steady like she'd just woken up from a dream. But I hadn't. I was still in it. And something told me it was only just beginning. In the hallway, as I carried her back to my room, I noticed the family Bible on the shelf had fallen to the floor. It lay open, pages rustling in the draft. The verse it landed on was marked with my grandfather's old ribbon. And he asked him, What is thy name? And he answered, saying, My name is Legion, for we are many. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Not because of what had happened, but because deep down, in a place I had sealed off long ago, I knew exactly what had spoken through my daughter. And worse, I remembered the last time I'd heard it. It was in the desert, in a stone room with no windows, when the walls bled and the priest screamed my name. And that thing, it had found its voice again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the hallway just outside Mara's room, the cold wooden floor pressing into my back, the dim glow from her night light spilling across the carpet. Every few minutes, I leaned forward to listen. Her breathing was soft and steady again. Normal, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget what I'd heard. I couldn't unhear the voice that came from her mouth, low and ancient like it had come from beneath the earth. At sunrise, I made coffee with shaking hands. I didn't taste it. My mind was already turning, faster than I wanted. It had been years since I left that world behind. Ancient languages, forgotten gods, cursed texts. But the voice from last night had dragged me back like a hook in my spine. I loaded the recording from my phone onto my laptop, opened up my old translation software, and pressed play. Her voice came through the speakers, steady and unblinking. Lakma di mana, sharia bitsulmotha. I paused it immediately. My throat went dry. It was Aramaic. Not just phrases, full, structured sentences. Fluent. Fluid. The kind of speech you'd only find in early religious manuscripts or in whispered temple rites. I knew that sound well. I'd spent years buried in it, back when I was still a professor at the university. But hearing it come from my 7-year-old daughter, it felt wrong, like watching a child bleed words not meant for this world. I opened an old folder on my hard drive, one I hadn't touched since Damascus. Inside were scans of parchment scrolls, handwritten translations, and photos from the monastery ruins I had once explored with my team. It was all in Aramaic, sacred, dead, and dangerous. And in the middle of it all, A file labeled Ask Her Text, Incomplete Exorcism. I clicked it open, and there it was, a near-exact match to Mara's words. The same phrases, the same rhythm. She had repeated, word for word, a passage from a ritual we had attempted years ago. A ritual that failed. A ritual that ended in screams, blood, and silence. I ran my hand through my hair, trying to slow my breathing. This couldn't be coincidence. Mara had never seen these files. Hell, I'd never let her near any of my old work. I burned most of it after Damascus. The rest I buried in folders with passwords I couldn't forget. So how did she know? I printed the passage. Black ink on white paper. Her words on the left. The ancient text on the right. The match was almost perfect. Only a few words were missing. The final verse, incomplete. I stared at the blank spot on the page like it might open and swallow me. My phone buzzed. It was a message from the school. Mara was running a slight fever. They said she seemed fine otherwise, but her teacher mentioned she had scribbled strange letters all over her math worksheet. I told them I'd pick her up early. The drive was quiet. Too quiet. The trees looked taller than usual, swaying even though there was no wind. I kept checking the rearview mirror. I wasn't sure what I expected to see. Maybe Mara. Maybe something sitting beside her. When I walked into the school office, Mara looked up at me and smiled. Like nothing was wrong. She had a crayon in her hand and was drawing a spiral on the back of a paper. But it wasn't just a spiral. It was a glyph. An old one. A symbol I recognized from the Ask Her pages. The seal of resting voice. Mara, I said gently, kneeling beside her. Where did you learn to draw that? She blinked at me. Her smile didn't fade. I saw it in a dream. The tall man showed me. My skin went cold. What tall man? She leaned close, whispering so only I could hear. He doesn't blink. And he talks like you used to. That night, after she went to bed, I locked my office door and dug deeper. Every page I pulled out of my old files felt like pulling bones from a grave. And at the bottom of the pile, I found something I had forgotten existed, a black and white photo from the monastery ruins. It was of a wall, cracked with age, covered in Aramaic script. And in the center, carved deep into the stone, was the same symbol Mara had drawn. The seal of resting voice. Underneath it, barely visible, was a faint name. Bravo. A name I hadn't heard in over a decade. A name tied to whispers, disappearances, and a scholar who vanished after trying to awaken something buried in words. Suddenly, I remembered what one of the locals in Syria told me back then, just before we left in a panic. Some languages aren't dead, Professor Callahan. They're only sleeping, waiting for the right voice to speak them again. And now, somehow, that voice was my daughter's. I stared at the recording on my screen, still playing on a loop. Lakma di mana. I should have burned those files. But it's too late now. Something has already started speaking. When I came downstairs that morning, the smell of something sweet and sharp, like iron mixed with sugar, was in the air. I followed it to the kitchen and found Mara sitting at the table, a dozen sheets of paper spread out around her like a bird's nest. She didn't even look up when I entered. She was drawing again. Mara, I said softly, what are you working on? She didn't answer. Her crayon scraped across the paper in slow, deliberate strokes. I stepped closer and froze. They weren't ordinary drawings. Not the kind a 7-year-old should be making. No flowers or suns or stick figures. These were symbols, ancient ones, drawn with eerie precision. Concentric circles filled with tight lettering. Triangles within triangles. And at the center of every single one, a small dark figure with long limbs, no eyes, and a mouth that looked sewn shut. A shiver crept up my spine. I picked up one of the drawings. My hand trembled. It wasn't just the symbols, I recognized the figure. I had seen it years ago, carved into the walls of a tomb in the Syrian desert. A being called Malakesh, the angel of fire. It was supposed to be myth. Just one of the many ancient demons whispered about in old Aramaic texts. But Mara had never seen those carvings. She didn't even know that word. Sweetheart, I said, kneeling beside her, where did you learn this? She blinked and looked at me for the first time. Her eyes were calm, too calm. The man in the mirror taught me, she said. I stared at her. What man? The one who doesn't blink. He whispers in the dark. He says I need to remember the words. What words, baby? She didn't answer. Instead, she went back to drawing. Her little hand moved with quiet purpose, as if she were copying something she'd seen 100 times. I gathered the drawings and took them to my office. I locked the door behind me and spread them out across my desk. I compared them to the notes I had hidden in a locked drawer, the ones from my old fieldwork, the ones I swore I'd never read again. The resemblance was impossible to deny. But it got worse. One drawing was of the monastery, the old stone ruin buried deep in the woods outside Willow's End. I had driven past it a few times over the years, a collapsed relic swallowed by moss and fog. Mara had never been there, never even heard of it, but her drawing was perfect. The bell tower split in two, the iron gate covered in vines, and just behind it, a dark, sunken stairwell leading underground. A place I never told anyone about. I backed away from the desk, heart hammering in my chest. I felt like something cold and ancient had wrapped its fingers around me. That night, I called Father Avery, the last priest in Willow's End. He had been here longer than anyone, long enough to remember when the monastery was still whole. I asked him to come by. He arrived just after dusk, wearing a threadbare coat and holding a rosary that clicked between his fingers. His face was thin, eyes sunken, as if sleep had long forgotten him. "I've heard stories," he said after I showed him the drawings. "About that monastery. About things best left buried." I leaned forward. "Have you heard of someone named Bravo?" His fingers froze on the rosary. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly. "Yes. Bravo is a man who dug too deep. Not with shovels, but with scripture. He believed words could wake the dead. That some languages, like Aramaic, were living things. Keys. And he wanted to open a door." "What kind of door?" I asked. He looked at me with a sadness I couldn't understand. One that never should have been built. Before he left, he placed a small wooden cross on Mara's pillow and whispered a prayer in Latin. I watched her sleep that night. Her breathing was soft, her hands curled under her chin like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't sleep. I just kept hearing her voice in my head. The man in the mirror taught me. And I knew then, whatever this was, it had already begun. The woods behind Willow's End weren't just quiet, they were smothering. The deeper I walked, the more the sound of the town faded behind me. No wind. No birds. Just the crunch of dead leaves under my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. It felt like stepping into a different world. One not meant for the living. I had passed the old wooden sign, half-rotted and covered in moss. All that remained of its words was a single letter, M. The rest had been swallowed by time. The path beyond it grew narrow and uneven, roots clawing at my ankles like bony fingers. I kept going. I had to. The drawings Mara made, those strange buildings with tall spires and the twisted symbols on the walls, they led here. The first glimpse of the monastery came like a breath held too long. Gray stone. Cracked arches. A spire leaning slightly, as if bowing to something beneath the earth. Nature had tried to reclaim it. Ivy crawled over the walls and trees pressed close, but the structure refused to crumble. It stood half-sunk in the earth, like it had been buried, and was now rising again. I stepped inside through what once must have been the front door. The wooden frame was long gone, leaving a jagged entrance. Cold air wrapped around me, dragging goosebumps up my arms. Inside, the smell hit first, damp stone mold and something else. Iron. Like old blood. Sunlight leaked through the broken roof, casting narrow beams that looked too sharp, too perfect. The dust danced in those beams, like it didn't want to fall. And in the far corner, behind what might have once been a pulpit, was a pile of scattered papers and torn cloth. I moved closer, careful not to disturb anything. The air was heavy here, like breathing underwater. There was a book buried under the debris, its leather cover blackened and stiff. I wiped off the dust and opened it. The first page was written in Aramaic, perfect, clean lines inked by a steady hand. It was a journal. The name on the first page made my heart stop. Bravo. I read through the first few entries, my hands trembling. They were filled with notes about ancient chants, rituals of voice and blood, and mentions of a living vessel required to open the gate of the wordless flame. The writing grew more frantic with each page. Symbols began replacing letters. Drawings appeared, circles within circles, bodies with their mouths sewn shut, eyes that bled ink. One drawing mirrored Mara's sketch exactly. A girl surrounded by flames, her eyes white, mouth open as if singing. The caption beneath read, "She will speak what was not meant to be remembered." I couldn't breathe. I slammed the book shut and stood. Every shadow in that place felt like it was watching me now. I turned around and froze. Scratched into the stone wall behind the pulpit was something I hadn't seen before. A word in deep, crude carvings. Mara, my daughter's name. Not just written, carved. This place knew her. Somehow it had always known. I ran then. I didn't look back. The forest swallowed the monastery again behind me, and I felt something brush the back of my neck, cold, wet, like a breath not made by lungs. I didn't stop running until I saw my car parked where the dirt met the road. As I got in, I didn't notice the bloody smudge on my back seat window. Not until much later. And by then it was too late. I parked my truck just outside the old gas station on Hollow Pine Road. It hadn't pumped fuel in over a decade, but the windows were clean, and the open sign flickered faintly in the glass like it hadn't decided whether to lie or tell the truth. This was the place the priest had warned me about. Inside, it smelled like dust and mothballs. The lights hummed overhead. Shelves held dusty cans of soup and faded magazines. It felt like the kind of place time forgot. And behind the counter sat a man who should not exist. He looked older than I expected, maybe late 60s or early 70s, but something about him felt older still, like he had outlived something. His hair was white and combed neatly back. His eyes were small, sunken deep, but sharp like they saw something behind me and beneath me all at once. "Jack Callahan," he said, like he'd been waiting for me. My stomach sank. I hadn't told him my name. "You're Bravo," I said, keeping my voice level. He smiled, slow and deliberate. "People used to call me that, yes. Not many people left now who remember." I stepped forward, feeling the floor creak beneath me. "What do you want with my daughter?" "She speaks," he said softly, folding his hands on the counter. "What has not been spoken in centuries. Do you know how rare that is?" "She's 7, I snapped. "She's never heard Aramaic in her life." I made sure of that. He nodded, almost approvingly. "You tried. But some words," he said, tapping his temple with one pale finger, "they bury themselves in blood. In memory. Not in books." I felt cold. Not just in my skin, but in my bones. Bravo stood, moving slowly, like someone with no reason to rush. "You don't remember the cave, do you? In Syria. The stone altar. The girl you couldn't save." I froze. "I remember her," he continued. "She screamed in 3 voices at once. You fled when the walls began to weep. But you heard what she said, didn't you? You heard the name." I did. I'd buried that memory so deep I'd forgotten how it sounded. "Cashiel," I whispered. He smiled wider. "A name older than any Bible. A tongue not meant for man. Your daughter has become a vessel, Jack. A speaker. And what she speaks listens back." I wanted to punch him. Or scream. Or run. But I did none of those things. I just stood there, caught in his voice like a spider in its own web. "What do you want?" I asked again, softer this time. "I don't want," he said. "I witness." The words chose her. Just like they chose you once. This isn't about wanting. It's about what must be spoken. What must return. He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a thin, leather-bound book. My hands went cold when I saw it. I recognized the symbol on the cover, a circle of jagged script and a sun with too many rays. The same symbol Mara drew in crayon 3 nights ago. He placed the book gently on the counter. "Take it. You'll need it soon." "I'm not playing your game," I muttered. He looked at me with something that almost resembled pity. "You already are." I took the book. I didn't want to, but my fingers moved anyway, like they'd done this before in some other life. Outside, the sky had turned gray, thick with clouds that hadn't been there before. I walked back to my truck with the weight of that book in my hands, like it carried more than pages, like it carried fate. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Bravo was standing in the doorway, watching, smiling. It started with the wind. Not a howl, not a whisper, just a low, steady sound like the breath of something ancient moving across the fields. I'd cracked open the bedroom window for some fresh air earlier, but now the curtains were floating like they were underwater. The air had gone cold, too fast to be natural. I reached for the window latch, but something made me stop. Silence. Mara's room was too quiet. I hurried down the hall, feet soft on the old wood floor. Her door was cracked open, and moonlight spilled across the hallway like silver blood. I pushed the door open gently. Her bed was empty. The covers were twisted into a knot like she'd left in a hurry. My chest tightened. "Mara?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I ran down the stairs, heart pounding, and flung open the back door. The wind hit me like a wall, sharp, biting, and filled with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. I didn't think. I grabbed a flashlight and dashed into the yard, the beam bouncing across trees and broken fence posts. My boots sank into the wet ground. That's when I saw them. Tiny footprints in the mud, barefoot. leading into the woods. I followed. The flashlight cut through the darkness, flickering sometimes, like it didn't want to see what was ahead. The woods were alive with whispers, leaves shifting, branches creaking, like they were leaning in to listen. I stepped carefully over roots and pushed through low-hanging branches, calling her name again and again. Then the air changed. Heavier. Still. Like the forest was holding its breath. The flashlight's beam settled on a clearing just ahead. That's when I saw her. Mara was standing in the center of the clearing, her white nightgown soaked and clinging to her small frame. Her hair was tangled. Her eyes were closed. Around her, in perfect formation, were dead animals, rabbits, birds, even a fox, all lying on their backs with their limbs stretched wide, forming the points of a giant symbol etched into the ground. A sigil. One I recognized. I froze. She was humming. Not a tune exactly. Just a string of soft, strange sounds. It was the same rhythm from the old recordings I studied in Syria. The same cadence from the possessed woman who didn't survive the ritual. The same tongue I'd buried years ago. I stepped into the clearing slowly, my voice a whisper. Mara. Baby, it's Daddy. Can you hear me? She stopped humming but didn't open her eyes. I took another step, fighting the knot of fear in my throat. The dead animals, the sigil, it was impossible. But it was real. I knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. Her eyes flew open. They were black. Not just the pupils. All of it, like staring into a well that had no bottom. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. She just looked at me like she didn't recognize who I was. Then, without a word, she collapsed into my arms. I carried her back through the woods, holding her tight. She was freezing. She didn't stir. Back in the house, I wrapped her in a blanket, turned on every light, and called the one person I never thought I'd speak to again. Father Ramos, the defrocked priest who helped me translate forbidden texts once upon a time. I didn't leave a message. Just 2 words. It's happening. After laying Mara in bed, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, marks on her arms. Not bruises from falling. They were symbols, burned into her skin. Ancient, cruel letters that made my stomach twist. I sat beside her all night. She didn't wake, but she smiled once in her sleep, and whispered something in Aramaic. I didn't need to translate it to know it wasn't Mara talking. It was something else, and it knew my name. The fire was dying in the hearth, and the wind outside scraped against the old windows like nails on a coffin lid. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the yellowed pages spread in front of me. They smelled like rot and dust, like something that should have stayed buried. My hands trembled as I flipped through the brittle notes I had sworn never to look at again. Names. Symbols. Ancient prayers. Warnings written in the margins in my own shaky handwriting from over a decade ago. Mara was asleep upstairs, or at least I hoped she was. After what I saw earlier, her standing in the middle of the woods barefoot, the way her voice had echoed when she spoke those words, I didn't know anymore. There was a wrongness in the air around her. A hum I could feel in my bones, like a frequency only the cursed could hear. I lit another cigarette, something I hadn't done in years, and stared at a passage I had translated back when I still taught theology. It was part of the Codex Heresius, an unofficial volume copied from even older Syrian scrolls. Back then, I thought it was just myth, stories cloaked in religious paranoia. But the verse now burned in my mind. The tongue is a doorway, and the child unguarded is the key. I remembered Syria. The old stone church cracked from earthquakes. The frightened villagers. The girl with bleeding eyes strapped to the altar. We were there to study religious influence on speech under stress. But what we found, what I let happen, went far beyond science. We thought she was faking it at first. Hysteria. Trauma. But she spoke like Mara does now. In Aramaic. Perfect, unbroken. And then she laughed. A laugh that didn't belong in any human mouth. It wasn't hers. I failed. I misread the final incantation, swapped a verb, confused 2 similar-sounding roots. Instead of casting out whatever was inside her, I opened a door. Something passed through. And when she died, God, when she screamed and burned under our hands, I felt it leave. I just didn't know where it went. Until now. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me. My heart was pounding. I could barely breathe. It all made sense now. That night, I brought something back with me. Not in my suitcase. Not in my notes. Inside me. And when Mara was born, something slipped through. A crack. A seed. This wasn't just about possession. This was about inheritance. I had passed it on like a disease. Not through blood, but through something deeper. Something older. The words. The knowledge. The language itself. I remembered holding baby Mara for the first time, her eyes looking straight into mine like she knew me. Not just as her father, but as something else. Something I couldn't name. I slammed the book shut and ran my hands through my hair. How do you save someone from a curse you caused? The hallway light flickered. A slow creak came from upstairs. Then silence. I stood, every muscle tense, and took one step toward the stairs. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft and rhythmic, echoing down the steps. Mara was speaking Aramaic again. But this time, she wasn't alone. The night felt heavier than usual, like the air was holding its breath. Mara sat on the worn rug in the living room, her eyes glazed and distant. She was humming something, no chanting. The words slipped through her lips in perfect Aramaic, clear and steady, even though she'd never learned a single syllable before. The sound crawled under my skin, setting my nerves on edge. I hadn't slept for days. Every time she spoke, it was like a crack opening in the world, a place where something dark and ancient was trying to squeeze through. I knew I couldn't handle this alone anymore. Desperation pushed me to call Father Michaels, the defrocked priest who once helped me after the Syrian incident. He was the only one left who understood this kind of evil, without judging me crazy. The door creaked open, and Father Michaels stepped inside. His face was drawn, eyes sharp but tired. He didn't speak much, just took in the room, the cold that seemed to cling to the walls, and Mara sitting silently now, her small hands folded in her lap. "We need to prepare," he said quietly, setting down a worn leather bag. Inside were old relics, dried herbs, and a thick book bound in cracked leather. Protective prayers, salt, candles. This won't be easy. I watched as he moved through the motions, lighting candles, drawing salt lines around the room. Mara's chanting stopped. She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Fear, confusion, maybe a hint of the girl she used to be. But then her face shifted. Her voice dropped into a low, unnatural growl. The air thickened. "The gates will open," she whispered. "The ancient tongue will sing again." Father Michaels knelt beside her, placing a hand on her small shoulder. "In nomine Patris," he began, his voice firm but shaky. Suddenly Mara thrashed. Her hands clawed at the air, and her voice split into a chorus. Some words were mine, some were hers, and others belonged to something else. I felt my heart hammering in my chest as the room grew colder still. Shadows seemed to pool in the corners, moving like living things. I wanted to scream, to pull her close and shut it all out. But I stood frozen, caught between hope and terror, watching as the battle for my daughter's soul unfolded before me. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving. And I knew this was only the beginning. The air in the catacomb was thick and cold, like it was holding its breath. My footsteps echoed unevenly against the stone walls as I followed Bravo deeper into the darkness. Every flicker of the torch he carried made the shadows dance, shadows that felt alive, waiting. He didn't look like much, just an old man with sunken eyes and a calm voice, but there was something beneath the surface. Something that didn't belong in this world. He moved with certainty, like he had been here before, like this place was his home. "You don't understand yet," Bravo said, his voice low and steady. "Mara is not just a child speaking a forgotten tongue. She is the living vessel. The one who carries the words that should never die." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my fear buried. "What do you mean? What words?" He stopped and turned to face me. His eyes, pale and sharp, held mine like a trap. "The vocal gate. It is a ritual lost to time, where language and blood become one. When spoken by the chosen, it tears open the veil between worlds." I wanted to step back, to run, but my legs refused to obey. "Why her? Why my daughter?" Bravo smiled, but it wasn't a kindness. It was a knowing, terrible smile. "Because she carries the mark you tried to hide. The demon you thought you cast away lives in your bloodline. She is the key to awakening what sleeps beneath." We reached a heavy iron door, rusted but still strong. Bravo pushed it open, and a foul breath of stale air poured out. Inside, I saw an altar, ancient and worn, stained dark with old secrets. Mara was there, lying still, her small wrists bound to the stone slab by strips of leather. Her eyes were closed, but I could hear her whispering under her breath, words in perfect Aramaic, weaving through the silence like a spell. I stepped closer, heart pounding, feeling the cold seep into my bones. "Jack," Bravo said softly, "watch closely. This is the moment the gate opens. If you fail, the world you know will be consumed." I looked down at Mara, helpless and strange, and something inside me broke. I clenched my fists, knowing I had to fight, but unsure if I was strong enough to save her or myself. The cold air hit me like a blade the moment I stepped into the catacomb beneath the monastery. The stone walls were slick with dampness, and the only light came from the flickering candles Bravo had placed along the jagged floor. Mara was there, strapped to an altar of blackened wood, her small body trembling but her eyes wide open, glowing faintly in the shadows. She was whispering again, the words flowing from her mouth like a stream I couldn't understand, but they burned into my mind anyway. Perfect Aramaic, faster and clearer than before. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I held the worn prayer I'd memorized years ago, the one I once mistranslated in that damn Syrian desert. The weight of failure pressed down on me. This was my last chance. If I got this wrong, if my voice faltered, Mara would be lost, taken by something older than time, something that spoke through her tongue. Bravo stood nearby, calm and unnerving. His pale face was almost serene as he watched, like he was waiting for the final act of a play only he could see. I stepped forward, the echoes of Mara's chanting bouncing off the walls, twisting in the stale air. I forced my lips to move, reciting the reversal prayer in slow, deliberate tones, each word a desperate plea against the darkness closing in. The language felt foreign on my tongue, but I forced myself on. Suddenly the air vibrated. A low hum filled the chamber, growing into a roar that rattled my bones. Mara's voice twisted into something jagged, her body convulsing as if fighting a battle no one else could see. Shadows writhed along the walls, reaching like fingers toward her. I kept going, louder now, voice cracking but steady. Flames flickered from the candles, licking the edges of the altar, then erupted into wild tongues of fire. Bravo's eyes widened for the first time. Fear? Surprise? I couldn't tell. Mara screamed, a sound so raw it tore through the stone. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The flames died, the shadows faded, and Mara lay still, silent, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Bravo was gone, consumed by fire or vanished into the darkness. I dropped to my knees, clutching Mara's limp form, tears burning my eyes. I had spoken the last word, but somewhere deep inside, a cold voice whispered that this was only the beginning. The air was thick with smoke and something else, something older and darker. I could feel it crawling under my skin, like cold fingers tracing my spine. The monastery around us was falling apart, bricks tumbling down, dust choking the light. Mara was strapped to the altar in the center of that cursed room, whispering words I barely recognized, but which burned into my mind. Her voice was steady, fluent, almost like she was channeling something beyond this world. Bravo stood near the shadows, calm and silent, his eyes glowing faintly with that unholy fire. I knew this was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment when the veil would tear, and whatever lay beyond would flood into our world. I couldn't let that happen. I took a deep breath and began to recite the prayer I had mistranslated years ago. The words felt heavy in my mouth, like dragging stones, but I forced myself to speak them clearly. The room shook. The whispers grew louder, filling every corner, until it felt like the walls themselves were alive. Mara screamed, a sound that was part agony and part something I couldn't understand. Then suddenly she collapsed. Silence slammed down like a physical blow. Bravo vanished in a flash of flame, leaving nothing but ash behind. I rushed to Mara's side, my heart pounding so loud I thought she would hear it. Her chest rose and fell slowly, the steady rhythm of life. She was breathing. She was alive. I carried her out as the monastery crumbled behind me, dust blinding my eyes. I didn't look back. The darkness was retreating, but I knew it was only temporary. Some doors, once opened, never fully close. Later, as I held Mara close, I saw the faintest glow in her eyes, a whisper of what we had fought so hard to keep at bay. And in that moment, I realized the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The house was quieter now. Too quiet, maybe. Mara sat by the window, her small hands folded in her lap, staring out at the gray sky like she was watching something no one else could see. The sunlight was weak, filtered through thick clouds that seemed to hold their breath, waiting. I watched her from the doorway. She looked different. Not just because she was quiet after everything we had been through. There was something else, something I couldn't name. A shadow behind her eyes, like a secret kept too long. At night, the silence broke. She would whisper in the dark, soft words I didn't understand. Words that didn't belong in this time or place. Aramaic. Perfect, flowing, and strange. I'd lie beside her, frozen, listening as the language slipped from her lips like a ghost song. I wanted to reach out, to stop her, but fear held me back. Fear of what I might awaken, or what she might become. One night, I caught her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes glowed faintly, just a flicker at first, like the last ember of a dying fire. I blinked, and it was gone. But the image stayed burned in my mind. I sat down next to her and took her hand. It was warm, real, but the chill beneath it told me this was not over. Mara turned to me, and for a moment, I saw the little girl I knew, the one who laughed, who asked questions, who trusted me. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft and low. The words never leave. I swallowed hard. The ritual had closed the door, or so I believed. But the echo had settled inside her, and maybe inside me too. I held her close and whispered back in a voice I barely recognized, "We will face it together, Mara. Whatever comes." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a language older than time itself. I prayed I had the strength to hear it, and to fight it, when it came again.